Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, we'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 12 of the anime series Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu Descending Stories. For all intents and purposes, the season 2 finale, and really the series finale overall, which actually kind of caught me off guard. I had expected there was one more episode left to the series before getting into this episode, but by the end, it encapsulates it all with a The End title card, and so you know this is the end of the story. And it was nothing short of miraculous and joyous and just utmost entertaining and poetic and beautiful, bittersweet to a point, especially coming off the foothills of the previous episode that just really emotionally impacted me. I cried during the episode. I cried during my review of the episode. Watching back my review, I got crying again. I was crying for a couple of days after the previous episode with the final culmination of the life of Yakumo, Kikuhiko Ban, going all the way back to his childhood. We've experienced every step of his life through the course of the 2 seasons of this series, and it just highly, highly impacted me. It was so poetic and beautiful. And it was intriguing as all hell to see Matsuda-san is actually still living in this episode that time skips us several years later. He must have experienced being the last soul to really share and spend time with Yakumo after he had passed on in his own dreamscape. He had said in that episode that the only thing he could really remember, he couldn't understand what he was doing there, but that he had fallen asleep at the hospital bedside of Yakumo, who had fallen into a coma and subsequently passed away. And by some divinity was he allowed to encapsulate in the afterlife, in Yakumo's final moments, the same role he had taken in the living, waking world, of being his guardian, his protector, his servant, his, right-hand man. I mean, he was there for that final journey of Yakumo's existence as a conscious being of energy and all that stuff. And it just, I was wowed by the fact that here he still is. I think he said he's 95 years old by this point. And it was just beautiful and poignant that. But what I really loved was the multi-generational aesthetic that has been in the foundation of this series, going all the way back to the first episode, with Yotaro seeking to become the apprentice of the Yakumo. Every sort of passive generation that we have experienced through the course of this show has this great innate, because of the art form that is Rakugo, a very sort of tactile name system that really speaks to that multi-generational story aesthetic. Going back to the very beginning, Shin and Ban, later to be Sukeroku and Kikuhiko, later to be, after the sad losses of Sukeroku and Miyukichi, would Kikuhiko become the Yakumo. He would take on the apprentice that would be Yotaro, who would later become Sukeroku himself. And here now, the young adult Shin is the new Kikuhiko. And I love how his mother Konatsu describes him as being nothing short of a Yakumo groupie. He is so obsessed with his arguably granddaddy's style, form and function of Rakugo performance. The very stoic, restrained, artistic, sort of hearkening back to the masters of old style that Yakumo put forth. And this is very much what he wishes and hopes to embody in his own seeking to become a Rakugo performer, which contrasts amazingly, poetically, and beautifully with his little sister, Koyuki, who, I was so bouncing off the walls when Konatsu had told Yotaro she was pregnant and she would be having a child, to see that this child looks like the spitting image of her in her own childhood, to see that her own interests in Rakugo are contrasted. I mean, it goes all the way back to Shin and Ban. It goes all the way back to Kikuhiko and Sukeroku, I mean, the Yakumo had that very stoic, restrained way of performing, whereas Sukeroku, the Sukeroku of old, was very much the boisterous, lively, fun-loving way of conducting himself in his performances. And this is what, Yotaro, now come the current Yakumo, that's the way he embodies his performances, and she loves that, whereas her elder brother Shin loves the more stoic way of doing it. I mean, it all comes full circle. There's so much essence of that. Even utmost representative in those names, as I say. It really puts the punctuation on that notion that the wheel is constantly spinning, that these human beings are constantly evolving their lives and their personalities, who they are, what their goals and dreams and hopes are, and they've accomplished so much. It's been so long since they've lost the Yakumo, and yet they are still beholden to this beautiful art form that parallels our own real world. It's finally on the cusp of aligning in this fictional world the way that the Rakugo is true to our own world, in that it was very much isolated to the masters of old for a very long time, and then they started to broach this idea of expanding outward, accepting newer Rakugo. Higuchi has been all about writing his own Rakugo for, Yotaro to perform, and he would only do this, which is again an homage to a real-world Rakugo performer. He would only do this once the master Yakumo had passed on, and he sought to then evolve this art form, evolve it, and make it a staple of the time and place he was inhabiting, he was living in, so as to draw the audiences in. And there's something for everybody when finally they managed to rebuild this theater that had burned down to every last detail. They completely rebuilt it from the bottom up. But now it's a showcase and a showplace of multi-generational talents, the young, the old, the Eastern, the Western. It's world encompassing now. And it just is absolutely mind-blowing in all the best possible ways to see Mangetsu and Shin and, Yotaro come, Yakumo, and Konatsu on stage together, to see everyone in the crowd, including Higuchi and Koyuki and even Matsuda-san, to see them all being able to welcome this audience into this inaugural grand reopening of this ages-old classic art form, but in a brand new way, touching all generations, touching all sensibilities. Oh man, it was just beautiful. It was amazing, miraculous, and beautiful. Up to and including what was probably the most controversial aspect for me of the episode, with Higuchi's putting forth this speculation as to who the real father of Shinosuke was. And when I'm first hearing him, sort of broaching this to Konatsu, seeking a confirmation that perhaps it was actually she and Yakumo who had birthed this child. The interesting thing is, this was my very first assumption when we first were debuted to Shin as a child, in childhood. I was like, no, really? I mean, he's kind of her adoptive father, the age gap and everything like that. I mean, she seems to hate him so much and want him to die, but she's so dependent on him at the same time. There is almost an antithetical doting on him, And so when I found that Yotaro had come across his own speculation that he put forth, that it was this crime lord and everything like that, like, I was kind of like, oh, okay, well, kind of relieved, But the thing is, the way Higuchi would then go on to explain how he saw it, if in fact this was true. The idea that this young man might internally encapsulate the blood and the artistic prowess of these two men. He may share the blood of Sukeroku, that lineage, as well as Kikuhiko's, as well as Yakumo's, all in one. And suddenly it was like a beautiful, rapturous flower that bloomed in my mind. Like, I had gone from being near repulsion to that idea, that concept, that they two could have been the parents of this child. And suddenly, because of course Konatsu, in her own roundabout way, she arguably confirms it in a sense. I mean, the impression I got was she was being sort of playful about it, but at this late stage in her life, she didn't really see the need to entirely dismiss it or lie about it. She said just enough that led me to think, okay, this is her way of confirming Higuchi's suspicions. And she'd rather no more be said beyond that point, but I was floored by that. Again, the idea of it encapsulating and speaking to that multi-generational divergence in the seeking to form and function of what the Rakugo is, having Shin very much hailing and hearkening back to the stoicism of old that Yakumo represented, whereas Koyuki, who may or may not arguably choose to seek this as her own career later in life, much preferred her daddy's style, the Sukeroku of old, Konatsu's father's style of old. It wrapped everything up in a tantamount beautiful bow, being given this privilege of seeing the lives as they continued on for these characters, moving years beyond the loss of the Yakumo, who we spent his entire lifetime with through the course of the 2 seasons of this series. And I love that we really got to know Yotaro and Konatsu more. We got to see them come together and align, and how much he cared for her, and how willing he was to take Shin in as his own child, and how much he loved Shin, and was even that much more boisterous and celebratory in finding out that Konatsu would have another child with him, having all the while the begrudging Yakumo, the old ornery old man, the grandfather that he was, just really dealing with that tumultuous internal conflict of embracing the idea that Rakugo is not something needn't to die with him, that it can exist beyond his years and it will become something else. His own personal form of Rakugo arguably was silenced with his ultimate demise, but at the same time it is so appreciated by his own son or grandson, depending on what perspective you want to have on it, and so many others who are coming to this inaugural reopening of this theater to celebrate the Rakugo's return, and it's burgeoning out into whole new vistas. It's amazing. It is nothing less than miraculous. This has been such a heartwarming, heartstring-tugging, intriguing, twisting, turning series going all the way back to the first season. Even at this late stage, midway through this season, to find that every assumption we had based on what we'd seen in the first season was not necessarily entirely true about the deaths of Miyokichi and Sukeroku, about who was involved, and how there were sacrifices made for the love of family and for the love of being together and saving each other's lives. And that's really, deep down, Konatsu was a savior to Yakumo as much as he was her savior. And even moving beyond that, Yotaro would come to be a secondary savior to Konatsu's life, and try to really persuade her to pursue her dreams and attain those dreams of becoming a female performer of this art form. In the series case, she's the first official woman performer. And it opens the door wide. I said something going back to one of the previous episodes where I said, with every closed door, another opens anew. And this ending thoroughly brings that forth. The beauty of that idea of life moving on, even if our time here on this earth is limited, generations will continue on. And in our own small capacities, we have the ability to touch and affect others, for better or worse. But if we put our best foot forward, imagine the wonders we can accomplish just affecting one other person, let alone handfuls, dozens of people, as the characters had amongst themselves, amongst their familial unit, to all of the patrons and theater goers who wanted to see these masters at work. And by the end, all discussion of grandmasters of old can be eschewed for the mastery of a whole of them. Yotaro, Kum, Yakumo, Kanatsu, Shin, Mangetsu, all of these characters who make up the current generation by the end of this series, by the end, all told, as I say in this series finale, they are all grandmasters for having lived their lives to the fullest, honored those lives of old lost to them, while also trying to bridge that gap between the present and the future, to widen that gamut, to broaden that vista, to be more accepting to all different walks of life. And this was just such an experience. I will be heavily surprised if any such anime this impactful, emotional, wondrous, compelling comes down the pike anytime soon. Because it was just wondrous. And it's really all I can say about it. I can only exalt this series on whole and this finale time and time and time again, ad nauseum, ad infinitum. And I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of this series finale, this season 2 finale of Shouwa Genroku Rakugo Shinjuu Descending Stories. If you loved it as much as I did, if not, why not? Let me know in the comments below. Although if you've been following the series, I'd be very surprised if you had anything less than just utmost satisfaction and joy for the way everything turned out in the end. But of course, I always love having that, conversation, love it or hate it, anything goes in the comments below. And yeah, so otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.